wearing my Back to the Future Marty McFly suit today. Very exciting. I don't get to put this on very often. And so, for the occasion, you're getting Marty McFly today. And as great as that movie is, it's got some complications. It doesn't follow realistic rules of time travel, which is too bad. But it's again, it's still arguably the greatest film trilogy of all time. I would
Well,
say.
unfortunately, in real life, we don't have a Doc Brown to help us out with that.
No, we don't, unfortunately. But we've got movies to start theorizing about how time travel might work. And I know there's been a lot of physicists that have talked about time travel from a quantum standpoint, from a realistic standpoint, and I've listened to um, a lot of recordings, seen a lot of movies, obviously, and I've come to some ideas, come to some conclusions about the realities of time travel. Because if we think about this, Avengers Endgame, I think, was the closest to a realistic standpoint of time travel that we've come to yet. They botched some things for the story. I think when they came back to the future, which I'll explain my theory on that. But time travel in itself is obviously very risky, and I think based on if we can get the mechanics right of time travel, in theory and in practicality, we can begin to see time travel is not what it's all made out to be. We would actually not benefit from time traveling because of the way the time travel should actually work. I say should very loosely because we're talking about the reality of time travel, right? Not the way it should be, but the, arguably the way that it is. And it's all theory. We can't actually test it unless people have already created time travel. And if that's the case, we wouldn't hear about it anyways. But the reason for that is because, let's think about this. Let's say we invent time travel right now. All right, we get into our DeLorean and we travel back to, I don't know, where do you want to travel back to if you could?
Oh, for me, I
Yeah.
would love to travel back to. I would love to travel back to the time of the Beatles back in 1964. You know, they're my favorite band. So,
1964. All right. We're going back to 1964 then, to the Beatles. As soon as we travel back from this point in our timeline, based on rules of Avengers Endgame, when you travel back to the past, that past becomes your future, which can't now be changed by whatever happens in the past. And so, when you inadvertently time travel to 1964, you're effectively removing yourself from this timeline. So, think about all of your family, all of your friends you are leaving behind in this timeline so that they will continue in a timeline in which you disappeared and never came back. You might return later on to a very similar timeline in which you do return, but in your quantumly speaking, in your vibrational timeline, you are removed from the remainder of your timeline's future and you don't return. So your friends and family in that timeline live as if you never came back. So we'll think about that. And then, so when you time travel back to 1964, you are now putting yourself in a new timeline in which you existed in that time. No matter what you change, just by your physical frequency, your physical presence being in that time, you are effectively creating a new timeline in which you existed there. So, anything you change in that past on purpose or on accident, right? We could even talk about the butterfly phenomenon. Right? You step on a butterfly, all breaks loose in the future, and you end up destroying that timeline. That would
Hmm.
actually be okay. And the reason is because you're not destroying your own timeline that you came from, because you cannot return to the timeline, the exact vibrational timeline that you came from. Your timeline that you came from will continue without you, but the timeline that you create when you go back in time to 1964, you can destroy that timeline. You might destroy your future, depending on what you end up doing, because that past becomes your future, but your life as you knew it in your past is all maintained in that timeline. Because how could it not? Because those are memories in your mind that, in your perception of time, had to have occurred and have to continue to exist in order for you to exist in the new timeline, not be obliterated as soon as you arrive in 1964. So that's why the timeline that you leave has to continue on. It has to. It has to
Hmm.
continue without you, because if, say, you went back to 1964, you had a great time, right? You listened to the Beatles, you you continue to grow up in that timeline. Would you want to return to the future eventually? Or would you want to stay in 1964 or continue in that timeline and grow old and die?
Mm, that's a tough question. There are like pros and cons to everything. It's like at the same time you think about all the consequence. Well, at the same time you think about the consequences you have to face through if you decide to make that choice. If you decide to make that choice to stay in that timeline, eventual timeline, you create like maybe create like some interference to that particular timeline and adding that to your life. Like would like would things be the same as it was then if you were a part of it? So
Well, it ultimately, arguably, I would argue it doesn't matter, because you've created a new timeline. You can do anything you want to that timeline. You can
mhm.
start
Yeah, I mean
World
look,
War
I
II
mean yeah,
early if you wanted to go back
yeah.
further. You can start World
I
War
think
III
one, yeah.